The Temple of Space was a lot to take in. I mean, it's literally a living exhibit of human civilization throughout Teyvat's entire history, curated and managed by the Shades themselves, so how could it not be packed with lore? And look, I know there's a lot of theory fodder here, and theorists are a-buzzin' with new ideas, as am I, but while analyzing the temple's contents from various angles in preparation for theory crafting, I ended up excavating a lot of really cool details and references that don't really add up to a full theory themselves, but are pretty cool nonetheless. And they're cool enough that I think they're worth sharing. So today, I'd like to do just that. I'll be taking you through the Temple of Space location by location, pointing out all the cool details and references that I found like a weird little tour guide. We'll start with the Sanatorium, then move to Luyang Academy, then make our way to the Desert Pavilion, the Mahavaipulya Chamber, and we'll finish things off with a final roundup of everything else that didn't fit into any singular category. Now you might have noticed that there are some locations missing from this list, like the Apathic Interval, Memory Core, and Chamber of Suchness. And that's intentional because those locations are going to be getting a deep dive of their own later on, which will also include a full analysis of Asmodee, her powers, a closer look at her Watchers, the twins, and the whole process of uplifting people from Teyvat. Now, could I have included that analysis in this video? Yes, I probably could have, but I'm trying not to make hour-long videos, especially when the content is particularly dense, because I value the sanity of myself and my editor. You know what else helps with my sanity? Managing my in-game top-ups with Eniba, the sponsor of today's video. Eniba has become my favorite way to top up my accounts for a bunch of reasons, but lately I've really come to appreciate Eniba's cashback offers on all of my purchases. Getting a consistent amount of money back in my account is so much nicer than having to deal with fluctuating discounts that you see on all those other top-up sites. Plus, I can use that cash back across different games. So if I top up on my Genshin account, I can use the cash back to top up my Star Rail account, just in time for the anniversary too. And using Eniba's top-up feature is easy. All you've got to do is pick your game, select the amount you'd like to top up, then enter the server region and UID of the account you want to top up on. Finish things up with your payment information and your purchase will end up in your account in a matter of minutes. Oh, and just in case you're worried about the pricing due to like currency conversion rates and stuff because I'm showing everything in USD, I will remind you that Eniba does have regional pricing, so prices will be adjusted appropriately based on your location. I got to witness this firsthand when I saw a lore buddy of mine in Korea top up their Star Rail account for way less than what I was getting charged here in the US. So I just thought I'd mention it to ease some concerns. Because Eniba is a great, safe, and convenient way to top up your account or send a gift to a friend. And if that's something you're looking to do, then you can use the link in my description to give Eniba a try for yourself. A big thanks to Eniba for sponsoring this video, and now we're going to proceed with our scheduled Temple of Space trivia roundup, kicking things off with a closer look at the Sanatorium. We're first introduced to the Sanatorium by an elderly man named Mann. He's the caretaker of what remains of the Sanatorium, and he's named after Thomas Mann, the author of the iconic 1924 novel The Magic Mountain. The book takes place in 1904, actually, and follows Hans Kastrup during his stay at a sanatorium in the Swiss Alps after he contracted a serious case of tuberculosis. I know it doesn't sound relevant, but stick with me. Most of the people Kastrup interacts with throughout the book at the sanatorium also have tuberculosis, and the mortality rate for the disease was very high in the early 1900s, so many of the patients are simply waiting around to die and reflecting on their life in the meantime. So naturally, the story ends up with a very heavy emphasis on mortality and consequently how each of them perceives the passage of time. Each character has their own perspective on how and when time appears to speed up or slow down, and Kastrup notably finds himself thinking about the relationship between time and space, noting that the speed at which time passes is dependent on whether or not one is moving through space or standing still. And the book provides a lot of commentary about the relationship between time and space, a commentary that I think is best summed up in a quote that was made by A.S. Byatt in her introductory essay for this particular edition of the book that my friend Schwan shared with me. To quote, "Space, as it rolls and tumbles away between him and his native soil, proves to have powers normally ascribed only to time. From hour to hour, space brings about changes very like those time produces, yet surpassing them in certain ways. Space, like time, gives birth to forgetfulness, but does so by removing an individual from all relationships and placing him in a free and pristine state. Indeed, in but a moment, it can turn a pedant and Philistine into something more like a vagabond. Time, they say, is water from the river Lethe. But alien air is a similar drink, and if its effects are less profound, it works all the more quickly." Now, I don't know about you, but I really feel like this quote captures the reason why the writers chose to emphasize and reference this book so heavily and explicitly within the Temple of Space. But there's still more, so let's continue. Mann draws a lot of his commentary on time and space from both Einstein's theory of relativity and Bergson's theory of time duration. Now, I'm sure you're familiar with Einstein's theory, and I'm not really going to go into the theory of Bergson so much because it's basically just a detailed commentary on the relative perception of time. But I do want to point out that Bergson first wrote about duration as a theory as a defense for the existence of free will in everyday life, which was an argument against Immanuel Kant, who at the time was arguing that free will could only exist outside the confines of time and space. Now, this debate interests me from a Genshin standpoint because time and space are two laws or restrictions imposed upon Teyvat, which denies its inhabitants the right to free will thanks to its system of fate. And it's also worth pointing out that Istaroth's other name is Kairos, which is the Greek word for relative or perceived time. So she is effectively the embodiment of Bergson's theory of time duration. And while we're on the topic of time-related names, the first person we meet at the sanatorium is Zeitlinde, who came to the sanatorium to look for her sister Romhilda, a former patient of the sanatorium. Zeitlinde and Romhilda are named after the German words for time, Zeit, and space, Rom. And the entire quest in the Temple of Space is focused more or less on the relationship between these two sisters. So you could argue that they represent two of the themes within the novel, the relationship between time and space. Especially if you take into consideration the fact that Romhilda vanished the same way that Asmodee vanished, leaving Zeitlinde and Istaroth behind wondering where the hell their sisters went. The second half of Romhilda's name, Hilda, appears to come from Old Norse Hildr, which means battle. Now, there are 1,000 different things that this name could reference. I'm personally partial to her being a reference to Brunhild, a Valkyrie from the Volsung Saga and Nibelungenlied, partly because Brunhild decides to exit life after the death of her lover, which kind of lines up with how Romhilda decided to go through a metaphorical rebirth by giving up all her memories so that she would find the will to keep on living after her fiancé went missing and allegedly died. But if Romhilda is a reference to Brunhild, then that could mean that Zeitlinde is a reference to Sieglind, another character from the Nibelungenlied. And while that could be true, I think the real implications are a little bit different. In the Magic Mountain Sanatorium, the patients listen to pieces from the 1828 song cycle Winterreise, specifically Der Lindenbaum, or the Linden Tree. Now, Der Lindenbaum is about a nameless person for whom the linden tree back home is their one true constant in life, and is therefore the place where they would like to find rest. Now, whether or not that rest is eternal or temporary is up for debate. In Mann's novel, the song seems to be used as an excuse to talk about accepting inevitable death, but the original meaning of the song was probably more of a reference to homesickness. Now, I think the linden tree is also probably meant to reference Irminsul in this context, because the souls of the dead within Teyvat find rest in the depths of the world tree, which is Irminsul. So Irminsul is a linden tree. And I think this because throughout the quest, Astoria will often talk to Zeitlinde about the philosophy of mortality, which suits the themes of the Magic Mountain quite well. Because when faced with the inevitability of death, one begins to question the meaning behind their suffering and what makes life worth living in the first place. And as I mentioned, considering death as a form of release from suffering is very much in line with how Der Lindenbaum is portrayed in the novel. And as a bit of a fun science-y tangent, I'd like to add that Carl Linnaeus was the father of taxonomy, and scientists later used him as a lectotype of Homo sapiens. That basically means he was used as like a baseline example or representative of his species, so humans. And this is relevant because his name, Linnaeus, means linden tree. So the linden tree is representative of the human species. And while I know Irminsul is typically referred to more in terms of like a Bodhi tree, which is typically a type of fig tree, the leaves of a linden tree are actually quite heart-shaped, just like Nahida's leaves. And its berry-sized fruits look a lot more like Irminsul fruits than figs do. It's not proof of anything, I just think it's interesting. And while we're on a subject, here's a fun fact. While not part of this questline, although she was still released this patch, Linnea's name also comes from the word for linden tree. And I can't help but notice how her design is very similar to the Linnea borealis, which also gets its name from the Swedish biologist Carl Linnaeus. Now, Linnea borealis also has the nickname of twin flower because its stem always branches off into two identical flowers. And sure, I'm doing a bit of pattern matching that may or may not mean anything, but Linnea being released this patch and then Zeitlinde also being a reference to the linden tree just like Linnea, and Zeitlinde looking like her sister's twin, while also being a metaphor metaphorical reference to the Traveler twins does feel a bit too coincidental to be accidental. And this is unrelated, but I'm also wondering if Nod Krai's nocturnal blossoms are also supposed to be a reference to twin flowers. The similarities are very minor, obviously, but they do remind me of the opposing energies of the Traveler twins. Just thought that was neat. As another fun side note before we move on, of all the characters to have a Magic Mountain reference, Wanderer was not on my bingo card. It turns out his voice line, The Wind Rises, is a call-out to the Miyazaki film by the same name, The Wind Rises. And that movie references the Magic Mountain extensively, and if you've seen it, you'd know what I mean. Now the movie is, on the surface level, about building military fighter planes in Japan, and Wanderer is a combat robot that flies like a jet who comes from Inazuma, which is supposed to be, Teyvat's Japan. There's a lot more we could unpack there, but I don't have the time or the words to articulate that right now. So all I can say is it feels very intentional. Especially because if you approach the Sanatorium in the intended order, the very first character you meet won't be Man, but Maki. And he ties into our very first area within the Temple of Space too. So Maki's real name is Escher, which should sound very familiar to you because 500 years ago, Dottore borrowed Escher's identity for an experiment in Tatarasuna, which is both where and how he met Wanderer. We've truly come full circle. Anyway, the real Escher in Genshin was actually one of the uplifted individuals, and he ended up pissing Melancholy off so badly that he got memory wiped and then exiled back to Teyvat. So what did he do to piss off Mr. Head Watcher here? Well, Escher is an obvious reference to the artist Moritz Cornelius Escher, who actually really did have the nickname Mock when he was a kid. Now, Escher was an extremely unique artist back in the early 1900s because his art was very mathematical. He became known for his hand-drawn tessellation patterns and complex geometric shapes like platonic solids. And this fascination with the relationship between math and art eventually led to an interest in the perception of reality and also optical illusions. So he eventually became very famous for drawing fantastical scenes that defied the laws of physics and pushed the limits of imagination. And he especially loved turning negative space into physical things, like in this illustration where the space between a pattern of carefully rendered birds slowly morphs into a fish. Now, Genshin's Escher was also a talented artist and spent a lot of time in Luyang Academy within the Temple of Space. And this Escher, like his real-life counterpart, also created these space-warping illustrations. And while the other humans only found these drawings unsettling, Melancholy found his work to be blasphemous. Because remember, in Luyang Academy, art can become reality. So bending the laws of space within art can bend the laws of space within the temple. And Melancholy saw this act as the defiling of his master Asmodee's domain of space. So he wiped Escher's memory and threw him back into Teyvat. Although it appears that Vitruvius gave him a note that may help him remember things eventually. Kinda like how we use Zeitlin's stuff later on to jog her memory after her wipe. But Escher isn't the only famous artist in the Luyang Academy. We've actually got two really cool ones that I want to talk about. First up, we have this elderly fella, Bosch. He's named after a Dutch painter from the 1400s, Hieronymus Bosch. You might not recognize the name, but I know you'll recognize his work, especially if you've played Metaphor ReFantazio, because the monsters of that game are pulled straight from his paintings. Bosch's works are some of the most unique, bizarre, and iconic oil paintings that I've ever seen. Because he didn't just paint people or familiar creatures like unicorns or sea monsters, he painted manifestations of the subconscious. So Bosch's paintings end up feeling like dreamscapes. They're these strange, impossible, illogical montages, but somehow they manage to capture the feelings that you have within a dream just perfectly. Just look at this little snippet from the Garden of Earthly Delights. He's got a pair of ears shot by an arrow that's wielding a kitchen knife as it mows people over. It's completely illogical, and it certainly has no roots or connections to anything in mythology or religion or anything else that I can think of. And yet, looking at it makes my ears tingle with this sense of dread that I cannot articulate. Like, it looks the way I feel like nails on a blackboard sounds. Also, I really hated fighting these things in Metaphor. Good lord. Now, I'm showing you this snippet in particular because it's from the Garden of Earthly Delights. And the Bosch and Luyang Academy is attributed with creating a piece called The Mortal Paradise, which I'm pretty sure is a reference to this piece. Now, this painting is actually a triptych, which means it was painted on 3 separate wooden panels that are connected by hinges so the piece could be presented opened or closed. The 3 inside panels actually depict the story of the creation of the mortal world, and triptychs at the time were meant to be read from left to right, so the left panel is basically the beginning of creation, and the right panel is the end. Or more literally, we could say that the left panel shows the Garden of Eden, a time when mankind was still permitted to live in paradise. Then the large center panel would show the mortal realm after humans left Eden due to the original sin, and the final piece depicts Judgment Day. And this piece is like the Where's Waldo of paintings. You can look at this piece for hours and hours and still find something new and bizarre in it, I swear. But one of the coolest and most neglected aspects to this piece is that when you close its outer panels, a brand new painting appears, one depicting the totality of the world shortly after its creation. So opening the triptych is like witnessing life's creation on Earth, and I just think that's really neat. Now this next artist I'm a little less sure about, but I think that Daoji here is supposed to reference Wu Daoji, one of the greatest Chinese artists of the 7th century. Now I could be wrong, but I feel like Wu Daoji fits here because he's basically a legend at this point, and by that I mean stories about his works are treated like myths. Like, one tale claims that he painted a mural for the emperor, then literally entered the cave that he painted, like a wizard. Meanwhile, the Daoji in Genshin painted a round door, kind of like a cave entrance, that we need to get through, and he was the only person who could help us go through it because he was the one who painted it. I feel like that kind of fits with Wu Daoji's cave painting myth. Now, the supernatural aspects of Wu Daoji's paintings seem to come from his association with Taoist temples, since that's where the majority of his murals were done. So maybe that's why the Luyang Academy has so many references to the Guhua clan, because the Guhua clan is Genshin's representative of Taoist cultivators. So given that Luyang Academy is a place where paintings come to life, and that all of the paintings we place into the landscape were made by Daoshi, I feel like Wu Daoji is a pretty good match for him. Also, as a fun little aside, Daoji mentions 2 Chinese idioms when we talk to him. The first is, forgive my pronunciation, Hua Long Dian Jing, or more literally, to paint the dragon and dot its eyes. Figuratively, this idiom is about adding that finishing touch that brings a piece of art to life. And what's interesting about this reference is that he makes it when talking about Ajdaha, because in Liyue, there's a legend that claims that Morax created Ajdaha and brought him to life by granting him eyes, which is Hua Long Dian Jing, literally. The thing is, Daoshi also says that this never happened, which suggests that Zhongli did not create Ajdaha at all, nor did he grant him a new body. And I think this makes sense if you subscribe to the idea that Ajdaha is the Geo-Sovereign like I do, although that's still never been said explicitly. Now, Daoji also references a second idiom, Hua She Tianzu, or literally to add feet to a snake. And this idiom has the opposite meaning to the previous idiom, because it's used to describe someone's actions as being superfluous or useless. I don't have anything to add about this idiom. It was just the first time I'd seen it, so I kind of wanted to share what I learned. Now, there's definitely more to talk about in the Luyang Academy, but that's all I really want to cover for now, so let's move on to the Desert Pavilion. Sadly, despite having a deep fondness for Sumeru and the little squishy deshi here, there's not actually a lot to talk about. The most noteworthy or relevant thing in this area is something said by Kashama, because depending on which Archon quests you've completed, her dialogue changes. So if you've completed the Sumeru Archon quest, she tells you that she's from the era in which the Dendro Archon has yet to become a child. But if you haven't finished it, she'll tell you that she's from Greater Lord Rugadavada's era. Now, going into this version update, I totally thought the Temple of Space was basically totally cut off from Teyvat, since it's a place where time doesn't flow. But that assumption appears to be false, as the people within the temple are able to be affected by Irminsul. How this works exactly, I'm not sure, but when talking to some lore folks on Discord, Steffi pointed out that the temple's rules have been breaking down ever since Asmodee left, so it's very possible that the temple was initially cut off from Teyvat and has been slowly reconnecting, hence the Irminsul tampering. And if that's true, then it would explain why keepers from the temple have recently started falling from the sky in North Mondstadt. And speaking of keepers, the Desert Pavilion is home to a unique type of keeper, the Punisher of Gomorrah. And I bet most of you clocked this guy as a reference to Sodom and Gomorrah, but just in case you didn't, both of these are biblical sister cities whose names have become synonymous with destruction, so these keepers are desert city destroyers. But they do have another name, though, which I think is a little bit more interesting, and that's Afar's Avian. I don't need to explain Avian, but Afar is likely a reference to the Afar Desert in Ethiopia. And the reason this is more interesting to me is because Ethiopia is the home of the Abyssinian or Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church, and the Abyssinian Church is one of only 3 churches in the world that canonized the Book of Enoch, and it's where the last surviving complete copy of the text was found. Now, the Book of Enoch tells the story of the Watchers. They were angels meant to guide humanity, but who instead mingled with them in order to create a race of half-human, half-angels known as Nephilim. And those Nephilim eventually caused God to flood the world. Noteworthy because the Temple of Space is cared for by 2 Watchers, one of which has fallen from grace like the Watchers in Enoch. The Hexencircle claims that the Nephilim were once the dominant race in Teyvat, claiming that they were the children of gods and humans. You can read about this in The Little Witch and the Undying Fire, which should be taken with a grain of salt because this is technically a fictional book, but it's also the Hexencircle, so who knows if it's actually real or not. It's also worth pointing out that Conrians in the Abyss Order also use Enochian magic. And one of our playable Conrians, Arlecchino, has a lot in common with the Watchers of the Temple of Space. I mean, the visual references are obvious, but let's not forget that her Bale Moon Bloodfire can erase people's memories. And the erasure of memories is something that is overseen by the Watchers in the Temple of Space. So for all we know, she could technically be a Nephilim. Half human, half god. Now, I do want to talk more about the Enochian references here, but I'm gonna leave it until part 2 where we talk about Asmodee. So let's move on. One of the other uplifted individuals in the Desert Pavilion is actually a follower of Bifrons. You know, the fungus god from Veressa's quest. Turns out he was always worshipped for being delicious, and the description for the new Geoshroom boss even talks about how the flesh of mushrooms was considered to be sacred flesh, which is very Eucharistic. And excellent for me because it fits into a really crazy theory I wrote a while back. Truthfully, though, I just like fungi, so I like to bring them up whenever I can. But okay, enough of that. Let's move on to the Mahavaipulya Chamber. Now, something that comes up pretty often throughout the entire quest is how the Temple of Space was meant to be a project of preservation, a museum exhibit, if you will. And these exhibits within the temple were meant to serve as an accurate cross-section or representation of Teyvat's history and culture. Now, if you talk to Okikuni, he'll tell you that Melanta banned works of fiction that were written by the Uplifted, partly because he thought those fictional stories contaminated the purity of the historical records stored within the library. Although it's more accurate to say that Melanta banned specific novels. Fairy tales and purely fictional accounts were still allowed, but any novels that were presenting a sort of alternate history or exploring what-if scenarios were the ones that got banned. And if you think about it, this makes sense because these novels kind of constitute alternate timelines that never happened, which makes them a perfect metaphor for Barbeloth's description of the Abyss as described in the Bubble World event. So Melanta saw these alternate history books as like an abyssal pollutant. Now, Okikuni is kinda mandatory to talk to, so I doubt you missed this tidbit, but the library itself is full of optional NPCs, and some of them have some very interesting things to share or reference something noteworthy. So let's talk about my favorite, starting with Diotima. Diotima lived in Teyvat during the time when the Moon Sisters and the Heavenly Principles still coexisted, and at the time, she worked as a boatman, loading the souls of the dead onto silver ships steered by lunar envoys, who would then ferry those souls from Teyvat to the cities on the moon, because apparently, in this era, the souls of the dead were not slurped up by Irminsul. The moons took them. 2 cool things about this. The first is that we can finally make sense of this boatman from Surumi Island. This guy was responsible for collecting the souls of the dead so he could ferry them off to the Lady of the Golden Hall, which we can now assume is a moon goddess. And it also means that these ghosts on the island hail from the same era as Diotima. The second cool thing is that we have confirmation that there were cities on the moon, and in fact, we've probably seen one of these cities already. In the Nodcry World Quest, Colors Out of Space, we get tossed into some strange liminal space full of odd shadowed architecture that's in ruins. Now, a lore buddy of mine, Audie, actually went and pulled the 3D model of this location from game, and it totally looks like a walled city or maybe a palace or a temple. And back when this quest came out, Audie assumed that this could be a location on the moon, and based on this new evidence, I think they're right. Their Reddit post has a bunch of different angles for the model, so if you want to see them, you can find a link in the description box. Now, Diotima also appears to be a reference to a character from Plato's Symposium dialogue, Diotima of Manatea, and his Diotima spoke on the philosophy of Eros and love. And I'll be honest, I'm not entirely sure what this has to do with ferrying souls of the dead, apart from like the way Diotima considered love to be a spiritual thing in its purest form, especially love of the divine. Maybe I could more accurately speculate on what this is referencing if we knew a little bit more about the lunar era she came from, but we don't have that information right now, so I'm not going to. Next on my list of interesting library personnel is Vinidia, also known as Madame Snow-Winged Goose. She's an obvious reference to Mother Goose, since she writes fairy tales and Mother Goose is a collection of fairy tales. But what's really cool about her is that we already knew about her. Her books are very popular in Fontaine, and even if you don't read books in Genshin, you're gonna at least recognize the story of Pear the penguin since he's featured heavily in Fremene's kit. And I just think it's really cool that we're meeting actual historical figures now. But as for the part you probably missed, you know how paintings can come to life in Luyang Academy? Well, the same is true of books in the library. If you ask Vanidia what that book is over there, she'll say it's a storybook that got knocked over. Then she lists several of the tales she's written, and the first one she mentions is about a never-ending tea party. And if you walk through these knocked over books, you're going to find a cat waiting for his friends to arrive at his tea party. You can track down his missing friends, but they're not particularly happy about it, and that might be because the tea party itself is endless. And that might mean that this scene is probably one of Vanidia's fairy tales made manifest because the book got knocked over. I think that's pretty cool. Couple of smaller mentions. This baffling fellow that speaks in riddles is named Kongshin, and I'm honestly only bringing him up because I do not understand him, but I am pretty sure that he's a reference to Zhaozhou Kongshen, a man once considered to be the greatest Chan master in the Tang dynasty. Now, Chan is a specific branch or practice of Buddhism, and a very prominent one at that. It focuses a lot on meditation and the nature of sentience, and Zhaozhou was known for his extremely witty and sometimes riddle-like responses to philosophical questions. I will not pretend to know much about him beyond that, but I have to include this because his Wikipedia entry used the following as an example of Zhaozhou's wit. A monk asked the master, "What is a true statement?" And Zhaozhou replied, "Your mother is ugly." And it's been days since I've read this and I'm still not over it. I'm probably not going to get over it because this is a yo mama joke said by a Buddhist monk in 8th century China. What? I can't linger on this. Let's move on to our final part of the library, which isn't really a reference, but more of a cool little detail I wonder if anyone else noticed. You remember how we had to jump into that book to collect a key for Dex? Well, the traveler turned into a knight, understandably and expectedly. But did you notice that Paimon turned into a flying lavender melon? I think this is really funny on its own, but I also think it's interesting that this is Ito's nickname for her, and wouldn't you know it, Ito made a reappearance this patch in both an anecdote and Linnea's story quest. I doubt it's a coincidence, but it probably doesn't mean anything either. I just thought it was funny. But while we're on the topic of books, we just so happened to get the ending volumes for one of Genshin's most iconic and mysterious books in the Temple of Space. And I am, of course, talking about Vera's Melancholy. I am not going to give you a full analysis or synopsis of the story, mostly because I don't want to. But I do think the ending volumes of Vera's Melancholy are worth talking about, so I do have to give you a little bit of context. At its most basic level, Vera's Melancholy is a story about a girl named Vera who thinks her current planet and life is too boring. So she wants to go out and explore the entire universe because all of the interesting things are out there. Eventually, she and her childhood friend Sachi meet a space-time traveler, Ike, and an alien princess who takes them on a series of adventures through the universe's vast expanse of time and space. Now, Vera's Melancholy is heavily inspired by the Melancholy of Haruhi, which follows a girl who finds the world to be very boring and wants to surround herself only with interesting things, preferably supernatural things like aliens, time travelers, and espers. It is soon revealed that Haruhi, unknowingly, has the ability to reshape or even destroy reality itself, but that power only manifests when she's bored or melancholic. So basically, she gets so bored with the world that her frustration causes her to subconsciously create an entirely new reality. And these alternate realities are called closed spaces, which are populated by impossible monsters called Celestials. Now, I do want to talk about the persistent theme of melancholy throughout the Temple of Space, since it's present not just in Vera's Melancholy, but also in the Magic Mountain and also Melanta's name, but that gets a little philosophical and ties into Asmodee's mindset, so I'm going to save that for the next video. Especially because I think Haruhi's closed spaces full of impossible alternate realities may tie into Asmodee's ability to create her own closed spaces within cubes. For now, let's turn our attention to the endings of Vera's Melancholy, and I say endings because there are two. One of the ending volumes contains the original canonical ending written by the author, and the other ending volume contains an alternate ending that was written by Zeitlin's sister, Hilda, who hated the canon ending and wanted to write a new one for her own satisfaction. The problem is, no one knows which person wrote which ending. But in talking to my lore buddy Mishri, who absolutely loves this book, I think we can safely conclude that the canonical ending is Volume 11, which makes Volume 12 the one that Hilda wrote. Let me explain why. So Volume 12, which is allegedly Hilda's volume, focuses solely on Vera, who, just before marrying her childhood friend Sachi, has to bid him farewell as he leaves to save the universe from disaster. Despite always having been the one to want to go on a big adventure, especially one to save the world, this time Vera waits for him at home because she's lost her love of adventuring. And the volume ends with her still waiting for him. But Vera believes that as long as the world hasn't ended, then Sachi must still be out there somewhere alive and well, because he must still be busy saving the world. And so, alone in her hometown, Vera whispers a plea of love from the heart of the world. Now, the reason why me and Mishri clocked this as Hilda's version is because Rom Hilda was the adventurous type, and she got engaged to a good man with a terminal illness. One day, he told her he was going out to save the world, just like Sachi, and he never returned, just like Sachi. So Hilda was probably in denial that her fiancé was dead. She wanted to believe that he had overcome his hereditary terminal illness, and so long as the world itself didn't end, she could believe he was still alive trying to save it, just like Vera. Also, the subtitle for this volume is titled A Plea for Love from the Heart of the World, which seems to be a reference to the Japanese novel Crying Out Love in the Center of the World, which is about two young lovers, one of which always wanted to travel but had a terminal illness and never got the chance. In contrast to the love story of Volume 12, Volume 11, which I believe is the canonical ending, is far more sci-fi. This volume only mentions Vera and Sachi in passing, and focuses far more on the space-time traveler, Ike. Ike discusses his plans for the future with the alien princess, claiming that he needs to fix the echoes of time that he created and merge his soul with an alternate version of himself. And at the end of the volume, it's not Vera that whispers a plea of love for the world. It's Ike, and he screams out a declaration of love for the world that is so loud it literally echoes through time. This more sci-fi-esque ending suits the original themes of the book a bit more, in my opinion, especially since the original author of Vera's Melancholy is a space traveler themselves. And we know this because when you're making your way through the Cage of Suchness, you'll come across two coffins. One contained the Abyss Twin, something we'll talk about in the next video, while the other contained the author of Vera's Melancholy, and he left a note behind. Quick sidebar, the proximity of the author and the traveler's twin kinda suggests that Asmodee may treat true Outlanders differently from Tevatian natives, hence their unique location. She probably wanted to keep a closer eye on them. Anyway, this author's note mentions that the author was found and captured after illegally entering Tevat. Now, the note doesn't say this explicitly, but it is implied since by the time of their capture, they had already received royalties from Yae Publishing House for the first 10 volumes of Vera's Melancholy, so they couldn't have been apprehended at the border. It had to have occurred after they've already been in the planet for a while. So the author was locked up in a coffin without a single explanation or opportunity to speak to Tevat's border authorities, which I guess just means Alice at this point. And they did eventually break out of their cage, but they must have dropped the final volume of Vera's Melancholy in low orbit when they left, since the Shades were the ones who found it. Also worth pointing out that the note is written twice, once in the common Tevatian tongue and once in the language of the Andromeda Empire, which is mentioned several times in the novel itself, suggesting that it's actually a real place somewhere in the universe, and perhaps it might be the author's homeworld. Now, I kind of suspect that Ike is a self-insert of sorts for the author of the book. Not literally, but kind of in the same way that Vera ended up playing the role of the self-insert for Hilda's version of the ending. Narratively, that would just make sense to me. I'd also like to point out that Volume 11's subtitle is The Beast Calling Out for Love at the Heart of the World, which is a reference to a 1968 short story, The Beast That Shouted Love at the Heart of the World. It's only 10 pages, and it kind of acts as like a commentary of the interconnectedness of space-time, and it's totally worth a read, so I'm going to leave a link to it in the description box, but in case you don't read it, here's a summary because I think it's just really interesting in the context of Genshin. So the story is a series of vignettes that spans both time and space, like I said, that are connected by loose threads. It starts by following the movements of a mass murderer whose likeness and expression was found on a 37-foot-tall statue of unknown origin on a very distant planet by an alien expeditionary force that had never even heard of Earth. And when the killer was executed, he cried out, "I love everyone in the world, I do, so help me God, I love you, all of you." That kind of marks him as the beast that cried love at the heart of the world. Now, the story then shifts to describing a phenomenon called the Crosswen, which is basically a central point of all time and space. space. And it's from this point that everything radiates outward to form the fabric of space-time. It's a place of pure stillness that's occupied by countless races from all across space-time that are trying to rid the universe of madness by draining it from individuals in the crosswind that are affected by it, like they do with this 7-headed dragon that they call the Maniac. But the scientist in charge of the draining doesn't contain the drained substance in its new vaporous form, but instead sends it to another space-time so it won't infect the center of time, which is where they live. And apparently, they mostly send it to Earth. This is apparently considered a crime, so the scientist is tried in court, then executed by draining. After which, a 37-foot-tall memorial statue is built in his honor by the scientist's closest friend. And it's the same statue that resembled the mass murderer we mentioned earlier. The story finally ends back on Earth when a man in Germany finds and opens a box containing the madness vapor, and the next day, World War IV breaks out. Now, this is just my speculation as I am trying to draw connections between this short story and Genshin, but I think the reason why this story in particular was chosen by the author of Vera's Melancholy and the Genshin writers has to do with the fact that Ike needs to hunt down an alternate version of himself somewhere in the depths of space-time so that they can fuse, perhaps to preserve continuity. The scientist in the short story also declares his love for the world and all people in it, just like Ike does, so I do wonder if the mass murderer on Earth was the recipient of the madness the scientist felt after having to perform the inhumane act of draining over and over and over again. And that's why the statue resembles both the mass murderer and the scientist, and perhaps it's why both of them declare love for the world when they die. It feels like their interconnected story is like Ike's story, as both would kind of represent a soul that's been severed in two, then separated across space-time. And this idea of someone having two parts to themselves that needs to fuse is a theme that we've already seen in Genshin a couple of times. But I think it's most explicit with Durin, because there were two Durins and they did have to fuse with each other. And more interesting still, Durin's story involved this concept of having two endings to one story, except one ending was categorized as a sequel to the other. And that's what they did with Vera's Melancholy. The author's original ending is labeled as Volume 11, but Hilda's ending, which was written in response to the original ending, is labeled Volume 12. And the process by which Durin fuses with himself involves him sort of like grafting a new future onto his past, which I think gives more context to a phrase that's found much earlier in Vera's Melancholy. That one quote where Ike says, "Only the future can save the past." Now, why Hoyo's bringing this up right now, I don't know. I mean, I do have some ideas, but they're kind of half-baked. But I'm throwing the observation out there in hopes that someone might pick it up and run with it. Now, after all this, you're probably wondering who this mysterious author of Vera's Melancholy is. And I don't actually know, but I think the most obvious answer would be Kleiner, Alice's husband and Klee's dad. I do kind of feel like he's the boring answer though, and I'm personally kind of mixed on whether or not I do think it's him, because like on the one hand, he is a decent candidate being a space seeker and all that, but on the other hand, the note they left behind says they weren't even able to plead their case to the border authorities, and since that's Alice's jurisdiction and Kleiner appears to be married to her, I kind of feel like they'd have another way to get in contact, or that she'd at least try harder to help him out. So while I'm mixed on whether or not it's him, I don't really have any better guesses for right now. And as a sort of closing thought for Vera's Melancholy, I do want to point out that Historia actually calls the center of the Pillar Hall, which houses the memory core, the heart of the world. And given that the Temple of Space is also a place of stillness, just like the Crosswen, and Asmodee struggles with melancholy, and the book is called Vera's Melancholy, I do think there's a possibility that Asmodee will be someone who lets out a cry of love from the heart of the world at some point in the future. But again, let's elaborate on that another time. And boy, this video has been long, and still it is nowhere near comprehensive. There's just too much stuff in this temple to talk about, and I haven't even touched on like half the locations. I think you can see why I split this into two parts now. But there are still 3 more things I want to mention, because they're cool and they're interesting and they didn't fit anywhere else, so here we go, rapid fire, let's go. First up, we now know where Arcadia is, and if that name isn't familiar to you, it was first mentioned way back in Kaya's story quest, when he sent us on a quest to find a magic sword in Arcadian ruins. We've been trying to figure out where the heck this place is ever since. Turns out Arcadia is just what Mondstadt used to be called during the Unified Civilization era, so Mondstadters are descended from Arcadians in the same way the people of Nodkrai and Snezhnaya are descended from Hyperboreans. In fact, the Temple of Space was also part of Arcadia, so mystery solved. Next up, let's talk about Dex. I've seen a lot of people in the comments and on Discord talk about how it's super weird that Paimon knew Dex's name before he was introduced, and I'm not exactly inclined to agree on this one occasion. And that's cause Paimon likes to make silly or obvious nicknames, and the name Dex comes from Dexter, which means right-handed, and Dex is a disembodied right hand. So I feel it's the same as calling him righty, you know? And when you put it that way, it doesn't seem quite as mysterious as it did. Although my editor did point out that Paimon has predicted the nicknames of characters before, like in the case of Sir Pounce-a-Lot, so maybe it does mean something. And lastly, I want to talk about Josephus. He's located in the memory core, and everyone calls him the master of anti-self-termination, and he says it's because of a math problem he once posed. Turns out this is a real math problem. It's fittingly called the Josephus problem. Apparently, Flavius Josephus was a Roman Jewish military leader who fought against the Roman Empire. The Roman army had managed to corner Josephus and his 40 men in a cave, but rather than be captured, they decided to end things themselves honorably. But ending your own life is kind of dishonorable and looked down upon, so they drew lots in sets of 2. So person A would then end the life of person B, and then another lot would be drawn, so that person C, would then end the life of person A. And then the process repeats until everyone is dead. 39 of Josephus's men died this way, until he and one other man were the only 2 left standing, at which point they decided to surrender rather than die. So this mathematical problem that resulted from this scenario is basically a means of calculating what the odds are for you to be the last person standing at the end of one of these termination rounds. And that anti-self-termination title that our memory core buddy has is a reference to Flavius Josephus. He's named after one of the last 2 men standing in the Circle of Termination. And that's it. I have no more fun things to share right now. But do trust me when I say there is more to discover here. For example, the uplifted residents give us a lot of context for the placement of events within Tevat's timeline. It's a topic I do want to talk about at some point, but I may not get to talking about it for quite a while. Now, I've mentioned it a few times throughout the video, but do not forget, I will be making a part 2 to this video that focuses solely on Asmodee, her powers, followers, and chambers like the Cage of Suchness. And we'll also be talking about the twins, the nature of Tevat, and what the themes of nihilism and melancholy can tell us about Asmodee's intentions and motivations. So stay tuned for that. I would like to offer a huge thank you to my channel members for giving me the opportunity to do these investigative compilations. They are very fun to make, and I always learn a ton, and I hope you all learned something too. So thanks again to my channel members, and another thanks to you for watching this video all the way to the end. You're special and sparkly, and I hope to see you all in part 2. Take care of yourselves out there, and bye-bye for now.